Welcome to Females in Fantasy, a podcast elevating the voices of women authors of science fiction and fantasy who write about kick-ass heroines. I am your host, Briana Da Silva, and this is episode 10. Before we get into today's interview, I have a little announcement to make. My Patreon now has been updated with some new perks. And now if you're not familiar with Patreon and you're like, you have no idea what I'm even saying, a quick intro to that. So Patreon is a platform that allows fans of a project such as this one, to pitch in $1 or $5 a month or something small like that in exchange for some goodies. For example, my patrons participate in the creation of this podcast. They are able to submit questions for my guests if they want to. Sometimes you'll hear when you're listening to it, I'll have questions from my patrons. I also have bonus content such as additional interviews that is only for them. And we have an online book club. So sometimes we will read books from guests on this podcast or just other female authors of science fiction and fantasy that, and then we get to discuss it, and it's pretty fun. But now, in addition to that, I have some physical goodies, specifically some branded bookmarks, stickers, and pinback buttons. Real talk, though, because this is important. When I first launched my Patreon, I had a burst of support, but since this podcast has started up in March, I haven't really had very many people, very many additional people joining it. I think maybe only one or two, to be honest with you. And I spend a lot of time and energy in making this podcast happen. Probably more than you expect. It was more than I thought it would be, to be honest with you. And I honestly can't commit to continuing this for a very long time if I can't make it financially worth it. At the very least, I need to make this project pay for itself. That is a big first goal. And Patreon, by the way, is not the only way that I'm planning to do this. I do have some other things in the works that I'm going to be announcing soon. But it has been 10 episodes and 4 months in. So if you've been listening to this podcast this whole time, hopefully that's been enough to decide whether or not this is something that you really care about. And would like to see continue. I know for me, I'm always slow to join other people's patrons or other people's Patreons. I sometimes switch those two words. Patron is someone that is supporting a Patreon account. It's because I usually want to interact with someone's content for a while or like listen to their podcast for a long time before I make that kind of a decision. So I understand that, and no pressure, obviously. But if you have decided that you do want to be a part of this, if you're like, yes, I definitely want a branded Females in Fantasy bookmark, or I definitely want a sticker on my laptop that says Females in Fantasy co-creator, or maybe if you're just undecided, you can head on over to patreon.com/Females in Fantasy. You can go take a look at the different tiers and perks and see if they interest you. And if they do, then click on the big red button, become a patron. Okay, now for the actual interview. Our guest today is the fabulous Briana Morgan, aka my internet twin. And this intro has been long enough, so I'm not going to say much about her, but just know that you're going to enjoy it, if only because how often do you get to listen to two Brees having a conversation? I mean, come on. Without any further warning or context, I am now pushing you into the pool. Here is my conversation with Briana. All right, welcome, Briana, to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being on. You know, it's kind of funny because we joke about how we're like internet twins.
Yes.
So we have almost the same name, although pronounced differently.
Exactly.
Yes, and we have a lot of similar interests and things like that.
You do. We do.
So my first question for you is actually from one of my patrons, and this is from Brennan, and she asks, and I think I actually know the answer to this, but she asks, what is your favorite book?
Oh, no. You definitely know the answer to this, as probably does anyone who follows me on social media, but it is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald.
And why is it your favorite book?
I really admire what Fitzgerald does in terms of imagery and the language he uses throughout the book. There are a lot of flawed people in that book doing some pretty messed up things, but he still makes it sound beautiful, which I find really impressive. And I think it still functions really well as sort of a piece speaking out against materialism, even now, which is pretty cool because that book was written so long ago.
Yeah, I know. I love that book. It really, I wouldn't put it as my favorite, but it is definitely up there on the, like, on my top, maybe top 10.
Right.
I love how it really, like, it stands still. I remember, like, it's one of those books that, like, most people end up having to read in school, I guess, at least in the US. But it's like one of those books that a lot of people, like, won't skip because it actually is kind of interesting. Or at least that was my experience.
Yes. And it's pretty short, which helps a lot. I feel like a lot of the books people have to read in school, like Jane Eyre, are huge. And then you get The Great Gatsby and it's like 50,000 words, which is not that bad as far as required reading goes.
Yeah, that's true. All right. So tell us a little bit more about you. How you got into writing, and then give us like a little bit of a preview of some of the books that you've released so far.
So I feel like a lot of writers say this, but I have been writing for as long as I can remember. In elementary school, I would sit with my brother and my grandfather, and he would tell us stories he'd make. I don't know how many he made up versus how many he just knew, because he was very good at that. So it's hard to tell what was an actual story versus what he just came up with on the fly. So I learned from an early age how important storytelling was. In elementary school, we also had, it was called the Young Authors Competition. So each class we'd take a day and you would develop like a short story or a little essay or whatever. And then the teachers would vote, and whoever won got to go to this little writers conference in the library where you got to sit.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, you got to sit with different kids in different grades and have a little snack and read your book. And it was cool because they gave all the kids T-shirts, and I still have one of my first Young Authors competition T-shirts. It doesn't fit, but...
Oh, that must have been really fun. I would have loved that at that age.
Yeah, so I guess just since then I've been working on becoming more serious with it. I didn't gain the discipline I needed to actually finish a book until college. I started college as a psychology major and a criminal justice major, which, because you know me, that probably doesn't surprise you. But I switched after my freshman year to an English major concentrated in creative writing. And that's where I took workshop classes where, you know, you're required to put out so much work per week. So that got me in the habit of meeting deadlines. And that work in college is really what I credit to taking my writing seriously and getting the discipline to actually finish a book instead of starting 3 or 4 and then just putting them in a drawer somewhere.
Yeah, I can relate to that. So tell us about the books that you've released, and also the one that you're working on right now.
Okay. So the first book I released, it came out in October 2015. It's called Blood and Water. It is a young adult post-apocalyptic horror. That's the best way probably to describe it. And it is about a boy named Jay who lives in a world in the wake of a deadly pandemic. He and his friends have to go out in search of a cure for the virus, which has attacked 2 of their number. I don't want to say which 2 because it's kind of a spoiler, so I'll just leave that out. So I wrote that book, like I said, in 2015. I re-released it in 2017 after I'd learned a little more about self-publishing. And then after that book came out, I published Touch, which is a 1-act play. I've always loved theater, and I've always wanted to write a play, so I thought I'd start simple with a little 60-minute one. And it is about a world in which physical touch has been outlawed and a girl who wants to go out and figure out why. And then after that, I published Reflections, which is a young adult urban fantasy and mystery novel about a girl who solves a local murder mystery with the help of some shapeshifters.
Lots of fun. And
yes. So, and then what I'm working on now, what is Girls' School, which is young adult urban fantasy or contemporary fantasy. It's funny. No one can really agree on what to call that anymore, but I digress. It's best described as Dead Poet Society meets Labyrinth Lost, about a school full of witches.
Okay.
And everyone's gay. So
that's a great pitch.
I always tack that on the end. I'm like, everybody's gay.
All right, sold. So I want to spend some time talking about characters, specifically the female protagonist of Reflections, and then also your characters in Girls' School, like whatever you can tell us.
Okay.
So tell us a little bit about let's start with reflections. Tell us about the main character, who she is, and then some ways maybe that you can relate to her or can't relate to her.
Right. So the main character of Reflections, her name is Ramachandra Ganeshan. She goes by Rama because it's much easier for everyone to say. And I gave her, it's a traditionally masculine name, but I gave that to her to sort of show that she's strong. She's a lot stronger than she looks and seems. And throughout the book, she starts off struggling with her self-esteem and her self-image because she's gone through a terrible sexual assault. And so she spends most of the book dealing with that and sort of the repercussions of that, how that causes her to view herself. And she goes from this place of just sort of doubting herself and hating the way she looks to, without giving too much away, being a lot stronger and more confident in herself.
Awesome. And then tell us about the characters in Girls' School.
So the girls in Girls' School there's 5 of them.
Okay.
And they're all 5 of the main girls, and they're all very different. Nice. And I don't think any of them are really like me except for the protagonist, Rose. She's very much like me, but more how I wish I had been at her age. She's very self-aware, and she's a little more outgoing than I was. But all the girls sort of have one definitive flaw that when they're together, it all works out. But if they were to just try to go about life on their own, it wouldn't work out very well. For example, Rose, the main character, she's cagey. She has a lot of secrets, and she's not very forthcoming. Charlie is melodramatic. Ronnie is volatile, June is timid, and then Billy is kind of reckless. And they all, because they are such good friends, they sort of accept each other in spite of their flaws.
Cool. So what was your first inspiration for, let's go back to Reflections, and then we'll come back to Girls' School again. Where did you get the idea for the Reflections story? And what was the process like for writing it?
Reflections, it's hard to say where I got the idea. I wanted to write a murder mystery with shapeshifters for a long time. I'm not sure why. I'm going to go ahead and blame Supernatural, maybe, for that.
Okay.
But the thing with shapeshifters that makes them so interesting is they can change their appearance, whatever they want. And for me, I was wondering what it would be like to be someone who hated your appearance, to suddenly get the ability to change your appearance. So that is most of what Reflections is based off. And then, of course, to add a level of complexity to it, the shapeshifters in Reflections cannot shapeshift unless they appreciate their base form. So in order for Rama to become an effective shapeshifter, she has to first get comfortable in her own body as it is.
Yeah. And then where did the inspiration come from for Girls' School?
As I mentioned before, one of my comps for Girls' School is Dead Poet Society. I have always loved Dead Poet Society. Okay. And I wanted to write a sort of Dead Poet Society story, but with all women. So that's one piece of it. And then I sort of imagine Girls' School as an alternate universe sequel to Dead Poet Society. Okay. In that, before the book opens, there's a student who has committed suicide, and there's this new teacher who has just come in recently, and sort of the whole school is it's pretty boring, but it's been shaken up a little by the events that happened before the book starts. And I also really love the idea of a school of magic people, like, Harry Potter and 1,000 others. So I combine those two. And then one of the only problems I really have with Dead Poet Society is how all of the boys were, just straight white boys. And so I wanted to make it a little more exciting. So everyone's gay. Or queer, rather.
There you go.
Different shades of queer.
Yeah. Yes. Different shades of queer. So we've been connected on Twitter for a while, and I've read everything you've published so far.
Oh my.
And one thing I've noticed that you always seem to do intentionally is include characters with identities and ethnicities and experiences that are quite different from your own. I really admire that.
Thank you.
And that's not an easy task. I know it requires a lot of research and empathy and things like that. So tell us a little bit more about the process that you go through, when you're approaching a character that has some sort of an experience that's very different from yours. What is that process like?
So for me, I don't know how everyone else's character creation process is, but usually before I get a story, I get a character. And when the character just sort of falls into my head, they already have their identity attached. So in the case of Blood and Water, I knew Jay was going to be a black guy. Like, I knew it. I knew he was going to be a straight black guy. I didn't have a choice. That's just what I was given, I guess, which sounds really weird if you're not a writer. Yeah. And I realize that, but yeah.
No, it doesn't sound weird to me.
But, so I knew he also grew up in Chicago. I have never grown up in Chicago. Okay. I am not a black man. I'm also not straight. So there were several different facets of his personality that I had to really do research into and pay attention to in terms of writing, because I wanted to make sure I was respectful to people who shared marginalization with him. I cannot stress enough the importance of sensitivity readers and even just critique partners who are different from you, because a lot of times you'll think you've written something fine and fair, and then you send it to a critique partner or an editor or a sensitivity reader, and they're like, hey, whoa, I know you didn't mean to do this, but such and such is kind of racist. And it's nice to be able to find someone who can point that stuff out in a loving, respectful way, as opposed to just, I've been blessed when it comes to sensitivity readers and critique partners, because my longtime critique partner, Coral, is very good at pointing things out that might be problematic without just sort of being like, oh, you're a racist, I'm never going to work with you again, you know? It is hard to give good constructive feedback sometimes.
Yeah.
But I definitely recommend it to anyone who's thinking of writing a character that has something outside of their own experience, to look into sensitivity readers and critique partners, because to me, at least, they've been invaluable.
I can definitely second that. And how do you usually find like critique partner? Oh, no, I know your critique partner has been like, you've been working together for a really long time, but for sensitivity readers, how do you usually find those?
I usually just send out a tweet on Twitter, or I'll mention it on Facebook. Just social media in general for me has been very good. I'm not sure how it works. I have a moderate social media following, I'd say. So it's been pretty easy for me. I think if you have fewer followers or you don't use social media as much, it might be difficult. But I do know there are services out there. I can't name any off the top of my head, but I know there are services out there to match people to critique partners and things like that. And of course, there's always different online forums. There's even Wattpad. If you're posting your story there, sometimes you can connect with people who will want to beta read or do a sensitivity read for you.
That's true. I never thought about Wattpad as a place to find like sensitivity readers. It's definitely a really good place that like sometimes you'll get like responses and feedback, I think, even if you're not asking for them.
Yes, definitely.
So it's a great way. I actually want to experiment with that at some point. I have a story that I would love to like put on Wattpad before I put it anywhere else, just to kind of see like what kind of responses I get. It's an interesting site. Yeah.
I have an older manuscript I've toyed with putting up on Wattpad, because I like the idea of it, but I wrote it way back in high school, so it's kind of cringeworthy to me now. But I think it would be fun to see what kind of workshopping it online on a platform like that would be like. So I'll let you know how that goes if I do decide to try that.
Yeah, sure. I'd be curious to hear that. So what is something, I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and talk a little bit more broadly about like speculative fiction and representation and stuff like that. So what is something that you want to see more of in speculative fiction, specifically with female characters? And you can answer that as like one question or two, whatever you want.
Okay, so I have two main things I would really like to see. The first one, obviously, is more bisexual representation and more accurate bisexual representation. I have read some books, I'm not going to name them because there's no point in that, that have bisexual representation that I have personally found problematic. And while I do agree that not everyone's bisexual experience is going to be the same, I do think there are some harmful overarching tropes that very much need to die that have still been around for forever. For example, I read a book fairly recently where the girl, she came out as bisexual, and then at some point in the novel, she starts dating a man, and then she writes that off as, oh, I must not have been bisexual after all. Which,
What?
yeah, which is not true. You can, I mean, I personally, I'm in a relationship with a heterosexual man, and that does not make me any less bisexual than if I were dating a woman or a non-binary or gender fluid person.
That's so frustrating. Like, what do people think that means? Oh, man.
Yeah, so that, and then, of course, you know, there's the idea that bisexual people are greedy or indecisive or promiscuous. I would love for that to just die and see, you know, more literature in which coming out isn't the focus. I do love coming out novels, but I also think that there are, you know, there's something to be said for a book where a bisexual character is just going about their business or saving the world or whatever, and it's not a big deal. It's just kind of a normal thing, because most queer people don't live a life where they come out over and over again and that's all they have to do. Most of the time it's just, you know, living your life, but you're also queer. So I think, yeah, I definitely like to see more of that. And then also I'd like to see, especially in YA literature, I'd like to see more female protagonists who own their sexuality and enjoy having sex, and it's not sort of taboo. Because I've read very few books where that's the case. Usually if a girl in YA enjoys having sex, she's slut-shamed or made fun of, or it's just sort of this weird thing that's never discussed.
Yeah, that's really problematic.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things, like going back to bisexual representation, this wasn't something in a book, but something I actually heard like in real life, I want to say. I can't remember where it was, but someone used the phrase non-practicing bisexual. I was like,
what's that supposed to mean? Like,
what does that mean? There was like someone that had gotten married to like someone of, you know, it was like a guy, I think, that got married to a woman and was like, I'm no longer practicing. I'm like, so for anyone that's listening and maybe is confused about what bisexual means. So just a quick here definition. It's just attraction, like you experience attraction to two or more genders. Would you agree with that, Briana?
I agree with that. That's actually how I pinpointed as well.
Yeah. So you don't have to be in a relationship with anyone.
No.
You don't have to be, you know, have had, you know, relationships or sex with more than one gender. Like you don't have to do anything. It just experiences attraction. That's all that means. So.
Absolutely. And you don't have to have, another thing that I've heard some people think is you don't have to be like into threesomes. That's another weird perception. They're like, oh, you like two or more genders? How about at the same time right now? No, not everybody's down for that.
No, some are, but that's not what that means.
Yes,
you know?
Exactly. Not at face value.
Yeah. And then I want to go back to the second thing that you talked about with like girls in YA, like being comfortable with their sexuality. I wonder why that is a thing. I wonder if it's just like some sort of a result of kind of our puritanical past, or like if there's just some sort of like, we're just still like not comfortable as a society talking about like female sexuality in general. And maybe that's just like also happening in YA. What do you think about that?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think, you know, especially in America, we still have some really closed-minded beliefs about sex and sexuality, especially when it comes to women and the notion of female pleasure. A lot of femme-identifying people have had to suppress their sexual urges, or, you know, just not talk about it, which is so bizarre because it's not like we don't get those urges. It's just, it's something that's not discussed. And I'm not really sure why in 2018 it's still a revolutionary idea to think that there are women who want to have sex and femme-identifying people who want to have sex, because it's a normal human thing. But I have noticed a lot lately it's becoming more, I feel like YA lit is taking a turn, and it is becoming more accepted that women and young women especially want to have sex. And I'm glad to see that, especially, I mean, even in The Fault in Our Stars, there's the couple has sex. And I was like, yay, all right, cool.
Yeah. It's not like teenagers aren't doing that, right?
Yeah,
so
they are.
Are we going to like awkwardly not talk about it and like pretend like, you know, like if we're going to write, fiction for teenagers, that's going to be like addressing things that are relevant to them and helping them to kind of like kind of guide them a little bit and as they're discovering themselves and things like that. I don't think it's going to be healthy or helpful to kind of dance around the sex thing and be like, oh, this is awkward. It's, you know, let's not talk about it. Like, hey, I mean, teenagers are definitely thinking about it and acting on it. So
Right.
and not to say that every single teenager is, but many are.
Yes,
so,
just because you don't talk about it doesn't mean it's not happening.
Yeah, and there's no reason to make it to add to the shame that already can exist in the real world. Like, we don't need to. Yeah, I feel like that's maybe a deeper topic that
yes,
deserves
I could talk for ages about that, as I'm sure you could too, because of our backgrounds.
Yeah. But yeah, definitely. There's a lot of our shared. I would say, like, my background is more of a conservative evangelical. I don't know if that was yours as well. I think I remember that. But
yes, my dad was actually a minister.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah. One thing I just want to, before moving on from this topic, one more thing I want to add about this that I think maybe like plays into some of the like the weirdness around teen sex and female sexuality specifically, is I remember learning when I was a young teenager from like one of the like Christian sex ed kind of things. I don't know. I don't remember where I got this concept, but it was commonly taught that like men wanted to have sex more than women did. That like they had they had those sexual urges. And
yes, and then you just kind of had to. They taught it very much as like you just kind of have to, oblige the guy and then just get on with your life. And I was like, that doesn't sound appealing at all.
No, as if like men are always thinking about it. And it's like, okay, probably there are some, but there are also some men that like aren't that interested in sex or are only marginally interested. And then there are also, there are women that are all over the spectrum too. So it's just like, that doesn't actually reflect the reality of humanity, that
Absolutely.
There's so many different experiences there. So, okay. So what motivates you to write?
Ooh, well, it's definitely changed, because I am, a cisgender white female. I have always wanted to use my privilege, if I can, to boost the voices of those who have been marginalized. So, for example, with Blood and Water, I only have one character that's just white, like Caucasian. Everyone else is biracial in some way that doesn't involve Caucasian alignment, or they're just like Jay and his sister Maya. They're both African American. So it's just, I don't know. The literary canon, as you know, is full of old straight white men. And I think it's time we change that, because that's not really the way the world is anymore. And it's never been like that, but definitely, especially in America, it's not really all that white here anymore. So
and becoming less and less so.
Yes. I think it's important to also, show the world as it is, even in fiction, which, also ties into the inclusivity. Also, since I've come out, I've really wanted to, especially since I write young adult literature, I've wanted to give young people that made me sound so old just then saying young people, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I wanted to give younger people the representation that I would have loved at their age, any kind of guidance that I can, because when I was a teenager, I can't remember reading one book with a queer woman in it, let alone a bisexual woman. And that, I know that really would have helped me, because I think that's part of why I came out so late, is that, well, relatively late, is that I just didn't know. I didn't know it was a thing.
Exactly the same for me.
Yes. And now that it's being represented in media, sometimes problematically, I want to sort of do what I can to put what I hope is a more respectful and realistic, depiction of it out into the world.
Awesome. So before we wrap up, I want to let you talk a little bit about your editing services, because that is something that you're still doing, correct?
Yes,
I should have asked you before this. Okay. And so what are your services? And if people are like needing an editor, how should they contact you?
All right. So I have several different editing services. Like I mentioned, credential-wise, I have a BA in English, concentrated in creative writing, with years of giving workshop feedback, peer editing, things like that. And I've also worked for publishing companies and done a lot of freelance for different small presses as well as independent authors. I offer query letter critiques. I'll even edit like essays and homework assignments if you have those. Poetry. Let me think. Poetry.
Pretty much all the things, right?
Yeah, I'll pretty much edit anything you will give me. The only genre I don't like to do is erotica. I'll do romance and I'll do books, like other books that have sex in them, but I won't just do straight out erotica. That's not to say anything about erotica. I just don't feel like I bring the best expertise to that. I offer different stages of editing. I have developmental editing, which is big picture edits, line editing, which sort of looks at the way the language is used, sentence structure, things of that nature. And then I do copy editing / proofreading, which is what most people think of when they think of editing, which is, typos, spelling, grammar, punctuation, all that sort of thing. I also have started offering a service that is just a basic manuscript critique, which is if you can't afford, say, a full-out developmental edit, you send me your manuscript and I'll do, it's basically like a beta read, but with a more critical eye. So I go through and I point out big picture problems that you might want to bring to an editor down the line for a developmental edit.
Interesting. Cool. And how can people contact you if they want to hire you?
So I have a page on my website that lists the different services as well as my rates. And you can also just shoot me a message on social media, whether that's Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, whatever. Probably Twitter is the best place to reach me. I don't know if you want to include a link to that or not in this interview, but that's probably the best shot.
Okay. I will include links to all those things, but also if you want to just list those out real quick, how can people find you online if they want to keep up with you, stuff like that?
Okay, so I'm on Twitter as Bri Morgan Books, Bri Morgan Books. I'm on Instagram as Briana Morgan Books, and then my website is www.brianamorganbooks.com.
All right. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today. This has been a great interview.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. I'll see you online.
All right. See you later.
Have a good day. That was my conversation with Briana Morgan. Hey, do you like Twitter chats? Because Females in Fantasy is not just a podcast. It is also an online conversation that you can join. Yes, you. Anyone and everyone is invited to participate in the next Females in Fantasy Twitter chat on Saturday, July 28th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll be talking about the topic of witches and how they show up in speculative fiction. So mark your calendar. Again, that is Saturday, July 28th at 11 a.m. Eastern. And you can use the hashtag Females in Fantasy to participate. As for this podcast, join me again in 2 weeks for an interview with Emily Skritsky, in which I totally fangirl because she is the author of one of my favorite series, The Abyss Surrounds Us. Plus, we talk about her upcoming release, Whole Metal Girls. Once again, you can support this podcast and all that I do here at patreon.com/femalesinfantasy. I am Briana Da Silva. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.